Okay, so I got a little off track there. So back to Vighi. Okay, so Vighi, it's true that it's very hard to summarize what his proposals are because there's con artistry in the middle of it. They are strategically woolly, vague, nonsensical in key sections, which is a tactic that a rhetorical tactic that you can read about on changingminds.org, the value of woolly language, but also we see it in Zizek all the time. He got very, very good at it. Strategic ambiguity or Vighi, I don't have his articles in front of me, but he's clumsy. But basically, what he's saying is he basically what you've got is a bunch of metaphors. He gives you metaphors that have no analogies that have no validity at all. They have no value in an argument whatsoever. It's simply a little movie that he's putting it in your head, trying to ignite a process of, cue. He's trying to cue prior propaganda masses of imagery. So the first thing is that you're supposed to envision the beginning of his story, which he, talks about financialization or whatever. You're supposed to envision, sort of reckless, aristocratic ne'er-do-wells on their yacht of ships, their yacht of state or their ship, their financial ship, just sailing, obliviously into some perfect storm that they're unprepared for. That maybe was because, they left a barrel of gas somewhere behind. They have no idea. It's sort of their fault, maybe. They have no idea. Suddenly they're in this storm. And we're all in the hold of their yacht. And so they have to do certain things. And then he covers over that he has no explanation at all with another powerful image, which is that they had to put the lockdowns were them putting the world economy in a therapeutic coma. And this is a lot like the way there's another gang now at Yale who does this kind of rhetoric. They like to use the word hubris, which has no meaning at all in reality. It is supposed to make you think of like a Greek city-state where there are some vengeful gods. Who could take revenge on you if you have the wrong attitudes. And then to imagine Wall Street as being that kind of situation, which it isn't. Anyway, so the economy's in a therapeutic coma. It means nothing at all, but we know that what he's trying to suggest was that, what he says is that the addiction, the society is addicted, society or Wall Street or banks. He uses these things interchangeably, which already is, a kind of deliberate, it's putting you in an infantile, you have to adopt an infantile attitude toward his storytelling to accept to accept it as a story, to make sense of it. And that's like an instinct that we all have, is to understand what people are saying to us. So we will give them the benefit of the doubt, just like we would correct a misstatement. He uses that tactic of deliberate misstatement to make you do that in your head, where you start to, make synonymous a lot of things that are distinct, and importantly so. So anyway, something's addicted to finance, and something else. The Fed is going to solve this problem by, with the injections, the repo assistance, the QE. He doesn't really understand what any of these are, but he mixes them all. But so the idea is that the Fed is going to create new money from thin air to feed these junkies, right, that we don't even understand. There's no understanding. He has no understanding of what someone like John Titus would mean when they say that these institutions are addicted to money, and he's not totally right either. I mean, we're not dealing with, we're just, he's good about the facts of what the institutions are doing. So, and then but in order to keep it from getting into the real economy, he uses that. Mean on the one hand, it's nonsense. As a Marxist would know, that's a nonsense term. This distinction between a fake and real economy, but that it has a force field around it to justify what he's talking about. He's saying in order for it not to become bank money. Okay, so that's his approach. That's his assertion that they don't want, that the Fed is going to be printing money that it doesn't want to become bank money. That is, it doesn't want to become numbers in bank accounts in retail banks. Money that can be spent by ordinary people who don't have Fed accounts. Okay, so and he says that meaning that would get into the real economy. And therefore, the economy had to be put in a therapeutic coma. He doesn't really even elaborate this as a sensible sort of proposal, but the implication is that you would go and that the bros on Wall Street would go and get blowjobs, but they're going to shut down the massage parlors so that the hookers don't get any money to go buy toilet paper, or the idea is that because he says if that flow of money, this new created money, happened, that would cause inflation. And first of all, the proposal that would spending causes inflation is, not true. This is a perverse sort of misunderstanding of inflationary pressures of competitive buying. Like a lot, housing market. You see it in certain kinds of markets where if people have a lot of money and there's a lot of buyers, like you open a market to foreign buyers, say, and you see the price go up. So that the asset is being inflated. This is really not related to the economy-wide inflation, which is the devaluation of labor. All it is the devaluation of the chit, that is the money, the currency. That, first of all, that would not cause it. In fact, the opposite. If you expand the money supply and you have a shrinking stuff to spend it on, obviously the money becomes worthless. And I'll tell you another anecdote that really shows me how fucking stupid and twisted a lot of the podcasters are, who presume to explain all this when it's really quite simple, and say crazy things. But anyway, with that, there is no such thing as a therapeutic coma for the economy. But the idea, the thing that you're supposed to imagine that he kind of means, and you're not supposed to really understand it precisely, that's part of the tactic, but that, if you can't spend the money, it can't inflate, is totally false and the opposite, right? If you actually contract production, there has to be an increase, a commensurate increase of use values, the production of use values with the money expansion, or you get inflation. But the other thing is that they did the opposite thing. The Feds actually deliberately created money, bank money in the so-called real economy, which is not what they had done in 2006, although they ran a very similar program in 2006, which I'll explain later. But in 2006, like the QE, that was the QE with this fascist program that they launched really in Japan after the burst of their terrible bubble destruction. That was, really want to look into how that really happened. But in order to fleece the working class, to pass this on to the working class, they invented this thing, quantitative easing, which was invented by this. I mean, the term was invented by this fascist, genuinely fascist banker named Richard Warner, who's another celebrity in this crowd, with Whitney Webb and people like that. Anyway, he's a like an imperial Japan apologist, and he talks about the economic miracle of Manchu Kuo, like literally talks about it without slave labor, that they had. Oh, look how sparkly the economy was when there was this massive slave labor and plunder, Japanese and genocides, and anyway. But for post-crash Japan, he invented this idea of quantitative easing, which is not. It's printing money, but it's not exactly printing money. What it simply means is that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, lets the retail banks park their assets, their troubled assets, and if he when he talks about his fantasies of Manchu Kuo, the idea would be, ultimately you could park assets that are suspended because of politics, like theoretically you could have sustained, the Romanovs if someone had just allowed them to sell to the central bank assets that they no longer owned, that the people had taken away. But so you have the strained asset, the assets under stress, or not even. It's not even that important that the assets be valueless, because really the CDOs were not that they did this with in 2006, 7, 8. But the central bank is just going to take the assets that the banks have, because the banks don't have cash. They have too much outgoings and not enough incoming, but they're solvent. They have lots of assets like treasury notes. So the bank will say, well, sell those to us for now and buy them back tomorrow. That's a repo market. Or sell them to us for now and buy them back next year. And that's the way that the infusions, the bailouts occur. But when that occurs, what's happening is the Federal Reserve, which, incidentally, I hope people understand that the Federal Reserve is a bank, is a private bank that's owned by all the other banks in its district. It's not a mysterious thing. It's not owned by the government, except it has to be managed by a government appointee. And there's a lot of rules about it. You could go back, and I don't even know all the rules now because they kept changing. But it's owned by, I think the New York Fed is owned by, Bank of New York Mellon and Bank of America and JP Morgan and Citicorp, and who ultimately owns those, shares, whoever, we don't really know. So whoever, you can't even do the plot that well because you can't really find out who the biggest share, but we know the billionaires are making the decisions. But the Fed is like bailing out, its owners, right? That's what it's going to do. But it means that they take these, they take the assets and they put them on the federal Fed's balance sheet. And most of the assets are the kind of assets that are always on the Fed balance sheet, the Treasury notes, the IOUs of the federal government. But they also take others now. That was the innovation because before that only so-called banana republics would have other kinds of assets on their balance sheet, that the Federal Reserve and the major central banks would only have the government's debt. So anyway, but they would take, so they mortgage-backed securities, CDOs, different kinds of derivatives they would buy, and maybe also government pledges from the states, in the state of New York and stuff like that, or the big things, I don't know, the subway, whatever, and your cities, and they would take them, and so then the Federal Reserve would technically own these, and they would create the reserve money on their own balance sheet, that is for those banks. They would put that money in the bank's accounts in the Fed, and that's not bank money. Nobody can take that and go buy a house with it. That's not how it works. It has to then the banks, then the money gets into the economy by the bank lending. So you go to your bank and you get a mortgage, and that's how the money appears. They make it on their computer, what they're lending you, and they take your pledge to pay off your mortgage, your that as in exchange. And then they can sell that or keep it. So maybe they give it to the Fed. They have more reserve money, but it doesn't really. It expands the money supply, but in a way that has other effects that are almost like a natural expansion of money supply. But then, what they just did, and they're now publishing stuff about this, what they just did in this last thing is they didn't, in the CARES Act and these pandemic plague, the plague up related similar QE or whatever they were calling it, or they were letting us believe that's what they were doing. But what the Federal Reserve did was created bank money, do exactly what Vighi was saying that they were trying not to do, so they put the economy in. What they did is they took the assets off the hands of non-banks. So they didn't make new reserves at the Federal Reserve. They made enormous increases of the deposits of the billionaires and of the big financial players that were being held by banks, retail banks. So say it's not Citicorp, but a big client of Citicorp. I don't know who. Say it's Macy's. I mean, actually, they put the retail things out of business. But say it's McDonald's, So or whatever, some company. They take the bad assets, or they don't even have to be bad. They do the quantitative easing directly with them. But since McDonald's doesn't have accounts at the Fed, what they have to do is they have to say to Citicorp, we're going to increase your reserves. That's what they did the last time. But you have to take that exact amount and put it in McDonald's account in your bank. Or you have to put it in, say a union, like the Writers Guild, my union. You have to put that in a bank, in the bank account of the Writers Guild fund, in bank money, and the kind of money that then gets spent or can be spent. And according to the Fed, they increased bank balances, the total balances of money. So this gives you a sense of the money supply, but we don't really know how much money is in circulation, but a sense of it. So the deposits by, a lot. There had been, I don't know, it had gone, 30, 40% or something, $4 trillion, $5 trillion minimally in the deposits, in bank money, spendable money that you can't help. It's going to flow through the economy like blood. So that's what they did on purpose. So it's the exact opposite. Even if there was a kernel of truth in Vighi's little explanation, that this would not be the case. They were doing the exact opposite than what he claimed they were doing, which is his big story is like they ran into the perfect storm and they're trying to save everyone on board, trying to save the ship, the financial ship, trying to save all of us in the hold. And in order to do that, they had to lock down. So that's why the lockdown happened. And it's absolutely ass backwards. But every single part of his explanation is relying on, a kind of bizarre fantasy that's just ludicrous, and also the absolute opposite. Even if you could try to strip a little out and say, I learned this little bit, that they were trying to keep the bailout money out of the real economy. What we know that's a nonsense statement, but we also know the sensible thing that it's approximating and perverting That's wrong too. The CARES Act and all this stuff, which was obviously set up long in advance, was specifically designed to increase the money supply of bank money, of which are and bank money. It was to increase the deposits, increase the supply in the money, therefore to increase inflation, which is then exacerbated by the lockdown, which Vighi says the opposite. That's not true, and it's also really stupid. You can figure it out yourself. So they exacerbate did by the lockdown. But the other thing that this does is it makes all the banks insolvent or close to insolvent, because then they, of course, pull the trigger on the same thing they did in 2006 to have a shakeout of real estate and banks. They hike interest rates. So hiking interest rates. So what they've done now, all the banks have now the deposits are much higher. And the deposits in the bank are the bank's liabilities. That's the red ink on the bank's ledger. So now the government has actually forced the bank to give money, just give it as a present to the ruling class, which is then keeping it in their bank. They force them to write this red ink, and then they hike up the interest rates, which just immediately gives the bank's assets a haircut, even though it's kind of notional. It's the so-called unrealized losses, meaning that the assets that the bank holds, which are the treasury notes or whatever, all these low-yielding assets, debt, they own your mortgage, they own the government's debt, that they bought when interest rates were low. Because the interest rates are higher, they couldn't sell that for what they had paid. But they're not selling it. It's just the bank's, it's the bank's assets that's collecting income all the same. It's not going anywhere. They're not selling it. So what they did is they really made all the banks on paper insolvent, but they can still function fine, so that they can go around and they can seize any bank they want. A regulator could seize them, and and then they created a run on the bank, the SVP, to as the first pretext of the first seizure of a bank that maybe is a little insolvent, maybe it wasn't. It's very hard to tell. Is it going to be about? It's a little underwater, right? It's the deposits, the debts are going to be a little higher than the assets, book value, because of what they just did, but no one's going to take all the deposits out, but suddenly they did. And then you realize if you have to pull back at that point, you have to see yet a bigger timeline that they just destroyed the bank with a run on the bank that was carried out with deposits that were the CARES money, was the fake, completely money that shouldn't exist. It doesn't make sense in the system. It doesn't come about as an accumulation according to the normal rules of the economy of what accumulating that kind of sum would involve, what it would cause. But it's a reflection of the political gains and robberies that they achieved with the plague program. Like you can actually add that up. You could say, they bankrupted all these people and the money seemed to disappear, but they snapped their fingers and there it is at the Fed, that it's that kind of amount. And then they create a bank run that then is the pretext for seizing that bank. And then when you pull back and you're looking at the longer timeline, you see right before they did this, or a little before, they dumped all the exposed positions, that is the shares of the bank, onto the mutual funds and the pensions. So they're going to take the losses. So it's a wonderful coup. And if they do that across all the banks, they'll wind up with the Omarova situation that they want to achieve. I mean, there's more, which I'll explain, but now this is 25 minutes. I'm going to stop.